It would not have been possible to produce all of the sessions and content for Punchback Print and bring you all of this content for free without the help of our amazing sponsors. So without further ado, here is a quick word from one of them.
From our £14 billion turnover industry, more than 20% of output is used for marketing and advertising, communications, adverts, and campaigns. There is no point in a low-cost email saying 1,000 words and being sent to 10,000 people if it is just read by 10. A recent study from Print Power found that newspapers can increase campaign ROI by 280% for retail, 70% for the automotive sector, and 570% for finance. It also found campaigns, including print, are 67% more effective at delivering new customers than those without.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I do want you to ask questions as you go along in the chat window, and I'll answer them as quickly as I can. I hope you enjoy it, so let's see how we get on. We're going to be talking about the journey of innovation. And one of the first points I'd like to make about innovation and its journey is it helps to have trusted friends that you can sound things out with. It isn't always going to go to plan, and sometimes it's going to be great, and sometimes it's going to be bad. As I like to express it, your mother and your lover never ask the questions that you don't want to hear. So find somebody that you trust who will ask those tough questions without being overly brutal and help you to understand what you need to do next. And that's one of the reasons why feedback is so important in what we do, because without that positive and reinforcing feedback, we're not going to be able to improve from where we are. Innovation is actually quite a simple concept. It's the idea of taking something, be it a service or a product, and making it into something that our customers will value, or in simple terms, pay for. Because unless you've got a customer willing to pay for that change / improvement, I would argue it's not actually an innovation. And let's look what happened in the past where innovation has gone wrong. Steve Sasson, 3 years out of university, first job, Kodak, comes up with this wonderful idea of creating a digital camera. My first digital camera was actually this model that's on the screen in front of us now. What happened at Kodak was that they were so fearful of the future, they ignored it. They realized that move to digital will eat the main product, and look where they are now. Compare that to Fuji. What Fuji did, also a filmmaker, arguably number 2, not number 1 when this was happening, realized that their core innovation was understanding the images that they're taking. So in the short term, they moved into the areas like medical imaging, where film had an advantage because the sensors weren't good enough. And all along that way, they were understanding what their customers wanted and what their customers needed. So when the medical sector transferred and moved into the digital space, they had the capability of being the digital choice for them. So Fuji ended up in a much better place than where Kodak ended up, because they embraced that change and looked for those areas of opportunity where they could excel and take advantage of what they're about. One of the first points I'm going to encourage you to do is to make time to think. So for some of my clients, they do that over the weekend when they know they're not interrupted in the office. I have another client where we literally go out for a walk and we discuss things, because that's how she stays away from the interruptions. And we're actually going to be going out for a remote walk this time round in a couple of weeks' time, where we're going to have the earpieces in on the telephones and we're going to do our brainstorming like that. So whenever you're in this space, you need to think where you're going to think. But you also need to think at different levels. It was nicely expressed as, am I looking at this at a 10,000 foot or at a 50,000 foot space? 10,000 is about the here and now, 50,000 is the strategic view. So make sure when you're doing your thinking, am I thinking short term, am I thinking long term? Many types of innovation, and we're going to run through the different models that people talk about now to give us a bit of a landscape, a bit of a background. So the first type is where you've got the problem is not very well understood, and where you're going to apply it is not very well understood, and that's basic research. Classic research undertaken by universities that are answering the question, this looks kind of interesting. The journey from basic research to being made into a useful product can often be measured in decades. A simple example of this would be CERN discovering, actually proving the existence of the Higgs boson. Fantastically interesting basic research, but the world hasn't changed for that knowledge, and probably the first use of that technology will be 20 to 30 years' time as a medical device. Sustaining research on the other side is where you know the problem space very well, and you know what you're going to do, and it's sort of small changes. Disruptive is where you're in a known space doing something that they haven't seen before, so that would be digital overtaking film. And breakthrough is where the problem's well defined and the solution is new. Another way of looking at it from a corporate point of view is where you use phrases like the Mavericks, high impetus, lots of focus, and they're transforming what you're about. Your adventurers taking you into new spaces, and they're looking for breakout growth. The reinventors protecting the now, and the adapters soaking up new innovations from elsewhere and bringing them to you. Some of the easiest to implement type of innovation is new to you, where you take a technique that has been used elsewhere, perhaps a different market, perhaps a different field, and adopt it to your change. So one example would be Formula One racing, being transferred down into the normal car. The way the technology behaves is broadly understood, and there's a pool of expertise, the Formula One engineers, and you've got the market expertise, and what you're doing is taking that technology, transferring it to your known domain, and you've got experts to help you on that journey. Another way of looking at it are the three different people types. You've got somebody who might be able to understand the market and understand where that's going, reading the meta trends. Or you could be the sort of person who really speaks to your customer and you understand what you're hearing on the street. Or you could be the sort of person who looks at a technology and transfers it into today by having that visionary piece. Normally, people are not all three. Or if they are, they're very average at best of all three. Your best innovators understand what their skill sets are, and they build upon those strengths. And they look for innovation that suits their personality because they know how to deliver it. Let's look at now two classic examples. Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, true visionary, changed markets. A lot of what he did, if you thought about it, existed in pieces. So before the iPlayer, there was various bits of MP3 players, but Steve managed to package it and focus it in such a way that it just completely gelled with the customer. I would argue that Steve was his own focus group, and in his particular lucky moment, enough customers were like him that there was a sustainable market. Apple has stumbled since Steve has left because they've not had that same clarity that's aligned with their customer base that Steve gave. Let's compare it to good old Bill Gates. Obviously very, very successful. Microsoft tends to be driven by consensus, committee, market research, and tends to be a bit lumbering, very broad brush, sweeping statements, but still massively successful. And without Steve at the helm, it's interesting how you look at some of the Microsoft products are now arguably much more attractive than the Apple ones. For most of us though, we're not as big as Microsoft or as Apple. And we're in a situation where it's David versus Goliath. That's a great place to be. I started out my career at BT, the massive phone company. At that time, 1 in 200 vehicles on the road were BT vehicles, just to give you a feeling of the size of the beast. And we were looking at what was going to happen when email arrived, to give you a feeling of timeline. My team was 3 people strong, and we were going around meeting tech startups that were over in Israel and America to try and understand what BT could do in email. These companies were 30 to 50 people strong, and they were somehow scared when we walked into the room, because they made the foolish mistake that they thought BT, 120,000 people, turnover in the billions, was spending serious money in this area. And in reality, it was 3 folks who were really a non-entity in the machine. The other thing I'd urge you to think about the David versus Goliath metaphor is that one of the best tools you have as a small company is nimbleness. You don't have access to unlimited amounts of cash, relatively speaking, but you do have the ability to be nimble on your feet and to change what you're doing. And that's why I hesitate about non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality disclosure agreements, NDAs, CDAs. Because once you start using an NDA, CDA approach, you're slowing down your innovation to match the speed of the other side. And the best way of keeping a secret is not to tell anybody. So for as long as possible, talk about features and benefits, not about technology, and maintain your nimbleness. All too often, we try to compete on price. This is not a helpful attitude. It's certainly an approach that our customers understand. But think about how you re-express the problem so that your customer resonates with the service you're giving them. Could it be shared risk? Could you look at leads generated, sales generated, or something along those lines, where you take a reduced upfront payment to cover your true hard costs and then buy yourself into the success of the company going forward? It makes it much easier for your potential customer to buy into that, because they can see that they're paying for success, and it's much more emotionally engaging. Be wary though when you make a success fee model, if you're buying it, because you want to put an upside limiter. Channel 4, the TV station, is actually a public TV channel funded by advertising revenue. When it was first launched in the UK, the government got the ITV regions to subsidise this station in return for a share of the advertising revenue if it became profitable. Some TV regions earned more money from Channel 4 advertising than they did from their own advertising stream several years later. Channel 4 forgot to put an upside limiter, and it cost them a fortune. So do think it through when you do these sort of things. Now, we have an innovation, we want to fund it. Of course we do. There are only 4 main ways that you can fund your innovation. Get some money from an investor. Remember, they're buying part of your company. Along with it comes a certain amount of baggage. Predominantly, your investor will believe they know better than you and will try to steer you. You can get so-called easy money, grants from the government. We'll touch upon that later. You can borrow it, or most importantly, sell it. I know quite a few successful customers who are customers of mine, who are bringing in their innovations to their customers and getting their customers to set the specification, to pre-commit to volumes, and in some cases to even fund the development because they believe in it. This is particularly true when I see larger organisations working with smaller organisations. The larger organisations are desperate for innovation. They also have the money to buy their way out of trouble, in broadly simple terms. So if you can develop a long-lasting relationship with some of your customers, that's really helpful. It's not often I get the opportunity to quote the Daily Mail, but what we do know is the amount of money that the UK government is pumping into the economy for all the right reasons is immense. Numbers like 30 billion, 300 billion was the total cost I've seen quoted around by people like the FT. This means that coming up soon, there's going to be an awful lot of grants sitting on the table for companies to engage to try and innovate their way out of this. And I'd urge you to keep an eye on it. So you want to go to, I'm going to leave this up, you can take a picture of the 2D barcode and that'll take you straight to the website. Innovation Funding Service is where Innovate UK publishes all the grants. There are two types of grants. A grant in the classic sense, but the much more interesting one for most people is the SBRI, Small Business Research Initiative, which is a purchase order. Because it's a purchase order, they're giving you 100% of the development costs. And if the product is useful, the government ends up becoming a prime customer. So they're going to be using a lot more of this to drive innovation through the public procurement purse, because it's one of the available levers that is actually going to work, because things like reducing interest rates are at the limits. So how does an SBRI call work? They set high-level challenges. So for example, one that's now about 2 years old, so I can talk about it. The high-level challenge was improving the efficiency of the railway network to encourage more trains to be used effectively. So some of the ideas that went in, one company put in an idea to put a laser to burn off the leaves and melt the snow above the wheel. Another company putting an idea to check how often people stayed in the train toilets. Because if you had a toilet on a train that people were obviously not using as much as the other toilets, it probably was dirty. And then they were using snap inspection teams to come on carriage C to check out that toilet because it's obviously dirty, and they were keeping trains in service that otherwise would have been pulled out because they fundamentally got too smelly. Let's go back to that laser on the train line. They got paid £100,000 as a purchase order, 100% funding. To design this laser, the government went, sounds great, try and design me a laser that goes on the front trains. So they did the design, and during the design process, they realised that shining very powerful lasers on top of highly polished steel is not a good idea because it tends to bounce up and might hurt people as you go through a train station. But what they did as part of that design process is they realised they could use microwaves, and then they got paid several £100,000 to build the microwave prototype, and it's literally an industrial microwave that burns off the leaves off the track as it goes along, and it's now being trialled and tested, and the train companies will buy it as a product thereafter. There are many things that print can do and solve these high-level problems through a bit of innovation like that, and it's the lateral thinking that's needed. The other thing I'd urge you to do is think about using a grant writer. A grant writer has the scars to help you navigate these, and they know what the questions really mean. I remember when I applied for a grant a few years ago with the Scottish Government, I got thrown out because I didn't know that in Scotland you had to send a certain letter saying that you complied with the Modern Slavery Act. It never crossed my mind to worry about telling the Scottish Government I don't employ slaves, but because I didn't, my application got rejected. I argue it's just like buying a house. The first time I bought my flat, I used a full price solicitor and got them to do all the paperwork. If I was a buy-to-let landlord, I would imagine I'd do more of those contracts myself. Now, I want to introduce you to the Catapult Network, particularly CPI, the Centre for Process Innovation. The Catapult Network is UK funded, and these are innovation centres around the country. And what they do is they help industry to understand the tools and techniques that they should be engaging with. They're a bit like the Fraunhofers from Germany. They were inspired by them, but they're not the same. The CPI network, they've been doing a lot of work with the printing industry on how they can support other technologies in printing medicines and printing electronics. So if you're a medium-sized company, I would urge you to go and engage with the Catapult Network and see what sort of events and programs they're running. Another really helpful, free at the point of use, is the Enterprise Europe Network. Now, obviously, the middle word is politically a little bit complicated at the moment, but I'm going to make a few points. The first, the EEN is in 53 countries around the globe and has a user base bigger than the Commonwealth. And secondly, I wouldn't be surprised if the middle word disappeared towards the end of the year, but the government is a little bit distracted with other more pressing issues at the current moment in time. What does the EEN do? They have fantastic understanding of the innovation geography around you. So that's fantastic for reaching out and engaging with other organisations that do different things but are based near you. There's a very good theory that says innovation is easiest when people can meet and engage with each other, so innovation tends to be clustered. Obviously, for the last 4 months, there's been a massive shift to online, and we've been all working hard seeing how we reinvent ourselves with Zoom calls and Skype calls. But still, the EEN does have that great local understanding. The other people I would urge you to connect with is the Knowledge Transfer Network, the KTN. They have fantastic sectorial knowledge across the UK. So if you're looking to break into a sector and you want to know who the experts are, I would go to the KTN for that national view. One fantastic toolkit that you get from the KTN, and again you can point your phone at the barcode and download it, is what we call this Horizons Toolkit. And basically it's a set of questions that encourages you to think through the challenges that you're facing as an organisation, as an industry, from your customers, and ask yourself, what can we do to get ourselves ahead of the game, to prepare ourselves for our customers to engage with you? This is a classic Friday afternoon exercise where you do that brainstorming to see how you can shape the future to suit you. Let's go into a little bit more of the classics theory. Open innovation, quite a simple concept. Chesberg, the guy on the left, the taller guy with more hair, is the inventor behind this. And he says there are several different forms of innovation, but broadly they can be broken down like this. Some companies develop their innovation in-house from start to finish. Classic IBM, for example. Tends to be slow and methodical and logical. BT, by the way, did that. Often, the next improvement they make is they might start buying in innovation. So that's where an external innovation gets brought into you, and there you're buying nimbleness. And then you customize it for your market. Then they start getting a little bit more adventurous, and they look at the projects that they previously should have killed and haven't killed and spin them out. So now you end up creating startups or license deals and service other markets. And finally, you get the whole hog where companies might come in and out as you engage with them for a short period of time, realize it's not really for you, and then you carry on with the innovation with somebody else. Right. Question I've just seen coming. Sorry for that slightly pregnant pause, everybody. I was just reading the questions. And we've got a question that says, can you explain the general process you need while doing this and what support you're likely to get with applications? So I'm assuming that means grants, trying to read backwards. So the support you would get, grants can be complex, as I explained. There's that need to know a little bit of the hidden as well as the understood. Is if you go to people like the EEN or the KTN, the way I would do it is I would go to the Innovation Funding Service, which is this one. They tend to give you a month's warning before the call opens, and they'll say, these are the things we're looking for, this is how much money. When you see a call like that that looks interesting, there'll be a video webinar that gives you the gritty detail, but also immediately I would reach out to the EEN or KTN and fire them off an email, ring their central number and just say, I'm a first-time grant user, I'm thinking of applying to this, please can I speak to somebody? That person should then give you the nitty-gritty quite happily, and if you're a first-time grant user, tell them and say to them, I'd like you to read my grant, please. And let's say the deadline is on the 15th of September. Make sure that if it was me, normally if the deadline's the 15th of September, it would open on the 15th of August and it would be announced probably on the 15th of July. So this is a conversation you're having in the back of July around now. I would speak to the KTN or the EN and say, look, the deadline's the 15th of September. I will get my copy to you by the end of August. Please can you feed back within a week to give me a week to improve it? And they will take you through that process. Alternatively, you could hire a grant writer. Typically, a grant writer will charge you anywhere between 5% of the fees awarded is the lowest that I've heard of, all the way up to an outrageous number of 20% in my experience. 10's a typical normal. Some of that will be upfront, some of that will be on success. If you're going to employ a grant writer, there's a few simple questions that you need to ask them. And the easiest one is, what's your success rate? If you look at something like the open call, the smart call, that has a 20-to-1 rate normally. It was a bit lower, but with COVID, we've seen that shoot up because people have got the times to apply. But when you actually look at the applications, a good number of them are out of scope, badly written through naivety and ignorance, and I say that in the most respectful way. If you look at the sensible approach, you'd normally see about a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 sort of success rate. So ask your grant writer how good they are on past experience. Now, grants typically for a small enterprise, the government will typically put in 2/3, you need to put in 1/3. On the SBRIs, that's a purchase order, so you get 100%, which is why I love them. Now, when you do your grant, you'll need to explain to them how you're going to get your match. You can say things like retained profit, you can talk about seeking investment, though they'd like to see investors are there. And I think that's the whistle-stop tour. We'll come back to it at the end when we've got a bit more time, and I'll move on there. Right. The Inspire Handbook is a fantastic set of tools for you to download and to engage with on the innovation landscape. It's an EU-funded project. The handbook's about 100 pages long, and it gives you all these different templates and methodologies that you can use. Again, point your camera at the 2D barcode and get yourself over there. And for example, one template they give is, this is how the journey of innovation happens for most SMEs. They have an opportunity, they need to define it, validate their assumptions, introduce it to the market, go large or go home, and then start again. And there's questions and fact sheets that sit behind it. So if you're struggling to get yourself started on this innovation journey, I would download that to see if there's a crib sheet or a fact sheet to help you along the way. The other thing is, you can use these sort of tools again with the catapults, the EEN, the knowledge transfer network, sometimes incubator spaces at universities, and sort of go with a half-completed answer and say, folks, I need a bit of help. Can you give me some time? And you'll find a lot of the time they will. I now want to move on to something slightly different, and that's more the attitude you should be trying to create inside your team as you go on this innovation journey. And when I was doing this in my last team, it was beautifully summed up by one on my team who described it as, I wobble, we never fall. And what resonated for her was the fact that she said, I can push myself, making my job so much more enjoyable, knowing that when I hit a problem, the rest of the team jumps in to bail me out. I'm growing so much as a person as a result of this, and I find the job really rewarding. And I think sometimes we forget that money is often the poorest way of retaining a person. And it's that sort of attitude which makes life a lot more interesting. Similarly, I'm a great believer in devolving power down to my team, because the best innovation I find for a lot of organisations comes from the grassroots. And so I always say, know how much you're prepared to lose with a person and tell them you've got complete trust in them up to that limit. You want them to believe in themselves and to try stuff. It might only be £500, it might be £5,000. These are not huge lumps of money. But I always used to tell the team, if I'm not helping you fix the problems because you're trying to do stuff, and probably doing your expenses, and that really is a boring day. They hardly ever made mistakes, to be honest, and they achieved so much more because they knew what safety zone they had, and as they grew and developed, you were able to give them more and more responsibility. Another thing which I find is really important if you're going through this innovation journey is to be the person who people come to for the answers. Not because they think you know the answer, but because they know you know the person who knows the answer. And at the current times, I am finding people so open to being reached out and contacted with. Personally, I am finding LinkedIn much more useful and easier to get through than email, and offering to have a telephone call with somebody rather than a Zoom seems to feel a bit more refreshing. I think people might be getting a little bit zoomed out with all the calls that are going on, so having that phone call really helps. Another fantastic question that's just come in. You're a collaborative industry. Do many companies join as a collective and apply for grant funding? Yeah, you can apply for much bigger grants if you do that. Single companies tend to be limited to £100,000 projects. They're meant to be scoping out projects. If you come together as a collaboration, need to get my mouth working again. If you come together as a collaboration, that increases to £2 million normally. So significantly more money. The government is always much more interested in funding projects that support a cluster rather than an individual. If you're supporting an individual, there's many more questions being asked about why are we doing this through government funding rather than normal business as usual company funding. Whereas if you see a cluster coming together, either the whole supply chain or across the geographies, and you see them coming together, you find it easier to believe that this is a problem bigger than an individual company can fix. Just going to grab a mouthful of water, and it's another shout out. Are there any more questions people want me to touch before I move on? Are there any courses that you run? Often you find incubators, accelerators, and the EEN and the KTN will run webinars and courses on the different grant calls and how to apply for them. A lot of them have newsletters divided by sector or geography, and it's really helpful to reach out and connect with those newsletters so you know what's coming. Unfortunately, one of the biggest challenges with innovation is you need to find the time to get out there and see what's happening. And it's definitely one of these things when it comes to grants, because if you find out about them after they've opened the call, you're on a 3-week deadline to pull everything together. If you're out there speaking to people and you might be given early visibility before the public announcement, you've got 3 months. That's a big difference. The other thing you can do is Innovate UK does publish their strategy every year from memory. And if you go and download their strategy, that tells you how much money they're putting in what top level amounts, by the number of millions. And that's really quite helpful because it tells you where the innovation's likely to be pushed. At the current moment in time, it doesn't take a genius to figure out there's been an awful lot of money pumped into COVID-19 and the effects of COVID-19 on the economy, for example. But I'm expecting in the next 12 months, hopefully that innovation spend will go more normal and there'll be the grand plan again that we're following along. Right. What I'd like to do now is touch upon something slightly different, and this is to do with how we communicate with people. And the reason why I brought that into today's talk, I'm just going to touch upon it, is the fact that I believe one of the big things about innovation is having the ability to speak to people either individually or one-to-many. And one of the key things that drives that is speaking. Now, Richard Green came up what he calls the 7 greatest speakers, and he says there's 5 things that connect great speakers together. They know what they're talking about. They have a passion for the topic. They know at what tempo to go, how to change it, how to slow it down. You feel the personality, and they have the confidence to deliver. He also makes out the point that it is very rare that everybody has all 5, and if you're getting above 3, you're pretty damn good. So, The other big thing he says is, even if you're talking one to many, remember you want this to be a conversation. If you're saying it and it's just the words, you're acting. If you have a passion for it, but you're not connecting to one person, even though there's many in the room, it's a presentation. But the most change happens when you have a conversation. I'm just going to have another glass of water, and I'm going to ask you to think through who are these 7 great speakers. The hard ones are B and E. I think you can guess the rest. Would anybody like to guess on the chat window who B and E are? Maya Angelou, Babe Ruth, yes, E, almost, Mark. So let's go through them. Louis Gregg was E, and B was Barbara Jordan. So now let's see why they're famous and what they did. Barack Obama does the power pause. He excelled at leaving those gaps. I say when I don't know what I'm saying. And I'm now probably going to do this for the next 2 minutes because I've reminded myself of my verbal tic. It took me 2 years to silently pronounce the word so when my poor brain goes I don't vocalize it. And so I tend to have quite a few power pauses. It's not because my brain isn't going crazy going it is. It's just that I'm pronouncing it silently. I love this quote from Barack. The future rewards those who press on. I don't have time to feel sorry for myself. I don't have time to complain. I'm going to press on. Barbara Jordan, 1960s America. You've probably noticed, black woman. Imagine 1960s America, black woman. That isn't a great combination. She became big in politics, and at Nixon's impeachment, it's argued that she brought him down at the end of the day when she spoke at around midnight and just used beautiful rhetoric in the third person, accused Nixon of nothing, but the room knew what she was talking about. And as she says, if you're going to play the game properly, you better know every rule. Einstein, all about simplicity. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I find so often when I'm listening to innovation pitches from companies, they feel the urge to spend 15 minutes to tell me their bright idea. It should be done in 15 or 30 seconds because you want that idea in the back of my head immediately and me digesting it. So if you can't tell me quickly, go back to the drawing board, rethink what you're saying and simplify it. Churchill, he crafted his words far more than people realise. He put so much effort into making sure that each word counted and it hit home. Courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. And for you guys engaging with your customers, yeah, do a pitch, but make sure you listen as well to see what the customer's trying to say back to you so you can react and take it on board. Now, Lou, he was a big baseball star of the day. And he got struck down by an illness. I think it was Parkinson's, I might be wrong. And they had a farewell match for him. And he went to speak to the packed Yankee Stadium and he ran out of nerves. And he turned around and started to walk back to the dugout. And his coach came up, put his arm around him and said, Lou, they're here to hear you. They love you. You can say anything, they will love you. But whatever you do, you have to say something. And he did. And there's very few audios of it of the day, but he spoke quietly from the heart and the audience came in. I also love his quote, I love to win, but I love to lose almost as much. I love the thrill of victory and I also love the challenge of defeat. I put that there because if you think innovation and business is always a winning streak, you're either not pushing yourself hard enough or you're deluded about the reality that you live in. We have to be comfortable in accepting that sometimes we have that bitter taste of loss in our mouth. Martin Luther King, he excelled at repetition and just hammering the point home. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. John F. Kennedy, he put the effort into making sure he was on the same level as the audience. For us, use the language of our customers' sector, not the language of us. We don't want to talk print. We want to talk automotive results if that's the sector we're engaging with. Take the time to understand how your audience talks. JFK was essentially American royalty. Yet he came up with things with, when written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters. One represents danger and the other represents opportunity. He was also the man who stood on a stage in Berlin and claimed he was with the German people, yet he was probably as far removed from as you could imagine from social status. If you want to play around with how your voice is, do download this little app and you can use it to work on yourself. You record yourself, it gives you a little spider diagram, and more interestingly for fun, it compares you to somebody else. I did this about 3 weeks ago, and apparently I sound like Jeff Bezos, Amazon. I think one of the Earth's most richest guys, not a bad guy to be like. I think I've got the better haircut, he's got the money. Draw your own conclusions, who's the winner? It's going to go wrong. If it isn't going wrong occasionally, you're not trying hard enough, as I said. Just accept it. Learn your mistakes, get yourself back up, and forget about it. Don't beat yourself up forever about that mistake you've made. And finally, time for the questions. I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. Again, point your phone at the 2D barcode, drop me a connect message and remind me that we met here. Otherwise, I'll be a bit vacant over who you are. So go into the chat window for questions. What is the best example of a company that with no process of innovation create one, and what was the outcome when it did? Wow, the next session starts in 15 minutes, folks, so be quick with the questions. I don't know. It's a great question. I wouldn't want to say it's the best example, but I've been in, say, a startup that didn't have one, and they all ran off in different directions trying to do good things, and that was really not effective, and that's what caused the end of that startup. The fact that there wasn't that focus, and they allowed panic to dilute the resources they had. So it's not answering the question asked, but hopefully it's all on the same lines, is, you know, be careful over how you spend your resources, and one of your biggest resources is your time. We always have time that we can worry about. So I'm going to wait a couple of minutes to see if there's any more questions. Otherwise, I'm going to stop so we can get ready for the next one. Final shout for more questions? No. In that case, I'm going to say goodbye. And I'll be seeing some of you in 15 minutes when we'll be talking about the value proposition and how that allows you to tailor your message to the audience that you want to engage with. I'll be sharing some tools and techniques and talking you through the process. Thank you for listening to me today. It's been really great.